Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley, and we are finishing up chapter 6 today. So let's get cracking. Mrs. Lincoln's grief was inconsolable. The pale face of her dead boy threw her into convulsions. Around him love's tendrils had been twined, and now that he was dressed for the tomb, it was like tearing the tendrils out of the heart by their roots. Willie, she often said, if spared by Providence, would be the hope and stay of her old age. But Providence had not spared him. The light faded from his eyes, and the death dew had gathered on his brow. In one of her paroxysms of grief, the president kindly bent over his wife, took her by the arm, and gently led her to the window. With a stately, solemn gesture, he pointed to the lunatic asylum. Mother, do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there. Wow. Okay. Like her son literally just died like an hour ago, and President Lincoln was like, yeah, try to control your grief, or we're going to send you to the insane asylum. So the word hysteria and the word hysterics, things that are associated with women, also come from the same root word as hysterectomy. And people like literally thought it was because of the uterus, because of the womb. And we were just reading about her womb. I know I read it. Maybe it was tomb. Rhymes with womb, though. I thought I just read womb. Anyway, so anytime a woman was honestly just showing emotions, people were like, "Oh, she's hysterical," and was like, "Oh, it's because she's a woman because of that womb inside of her," and just shuttled her off to an insane asylum, or locked her in a room with yellow wallpaper, which is a totally different story. It's good if you've never read it. Yellow wallpaper. Um, so anyway, I'm a little flabbergasted that President Lincoln said that to her like within an hour of her son dying, but to not totally lambaste him. He is the president, she is the first lady, and they really have to pull themselves together. They have to not only look the part of leading the country, they have to be the part of leading the country, and a country at war at that. Speaking of the country being at war, I have no idea about the circumstances surrounding Willie Lincoln's death, but now I'm like wondering, was he murdered? Was it because the country is at war and somebody was trying to get Lincoln off of his game? Like, I don't know. I bet there's a conspiracy theory about that. Anyway, Mrs. Lincoln was so completely overwhelmed with sorrow that she did not attend the funeral. Oh, I can't even imagine going to one of my kids' funerals. That's got to be the worst thing in the world. I literally can't imagine anything worse than one of my children dying. But to not go to the funeral, oh. Willie was laid to rest in the cemetery, and the White House was draped in mourning. Black crape everywhere met the eye, contrasting strangely with the gay and brilliant colors of a few days before. And like they would literally hang black banners on homes where somebody had just died. So she's saying that the White House is now festooned with these black banners, whereas a couple of days ago there was the party and everything was bright and gay. Black crape everywhere met the eye, contrasting strangely with the gay and brilliant colors of a few days before. Party dresses were laid aside, and everyone who crossed the threshold of the presidential mansion spoke in subdued tones when they thought of the sweet boy at rest under the sod and the dew. Something else also, I don't know if we're about to run into it here, but women in mourning, particularly if they were mourning their husbands at this time, couldn't get a whole new wardrobe of all black. So they would take many of the articles of clothing that they had and dye them black, and they would wear black for their mourning period. Previous to this, I had lost my son. Oh, Mrs. Keckley. I was wondering what your kid was up to. Leaving Wilberforce, he went to the battlefield with the 3 months' troops and was killed in Missouri. found his grave on the battlefield where the gallant General Lyon fell. It was a sad blow to me, and the kind womanly letter that Mrs. Lincoln wrote to me when she heard of my bereavement was full of golden words of comfort. Nathaniel Parker Willis, the genial poet, now sleeping in his grave, wrote this beautiful sketch of Willie Lincoln after the sad death of the bright eyed boy. This little fellow had his acquaintances among his father's friends, and I chanced to be one of them. He never failed to seek me out in the crowd, shake hands, and make some pleasant remark, and this, in a boy of 10 years of age, was, to say the least, endearing to a stranger. But he had more than mere affectionateness. That literally says affectionateness. And this is Nathaniel Parker Willis, a poet who is writing something after the death of Willie Lincoln, just to reiterate what we're reading right here. And it's kind of lengthy. It's in quotations. Oh wow, it's definitely lengthy. It it takes us all the way into the end of the chapter, which is about 4 pages away. So we're reading 4 pages of the words of Nathaniel Parker Willis, a poet who was dead at the time Elizabeth Keckley wrote this, but he wrote this sketch about Willie Lincoln. If you've ever heard of an ode is, this isn't a poem, it's prose, but an ode is a poem written to honor somebody or something. They don't have to be dead, but this is reminding me of an ode. So we'll start again. I got caught up at the word affectionateness. So we'll start back at the beginning of Nathaniel Parker Willis's words. This little excuse me. This little fellow had his acquaintances among his father's friends, and I chanced to be one of them. He never failed to seek me out in the crowd, shake hands, and make some pleasant remark, and this, in a boy of 10 years of age, was, to say the least, endearing to a stranger. But he had more than mere affectionateness. His self-possession, aplomb, as the French call it, was extraordinary. I was one day passing the White House when he was outside with a playfellow on the sidewalk. Mr. Seward drove in with Prince Napoleon and 2 of his suite in the carriage, and in a mock heroic way, terms of intimacy evidently existing between the boy and the secretary, the official gentleman took off his hat, and the Napoleon did the same, all making the young Prince President a ceremonious salute. Not a bit staggered with the homage, Willie drew himself up to his full height, took off his little cap with graceful self-possession, and bowed down formally to the ground, like a little ambassador. They drove past, and he went on unconcernedly with his play, the impromptu readiness and good judgment being clearly a part of his nature. His genial and open expression of countenance was none the less ingenuous and fearless for a certain tincture of fun, and it was in this mingling of qualities that he so faithfully resembled his father. I am excited for the word ingenuineness because I definitely am familiar with the word disingenuineness, and I don't know that I've ever actually heard the word ingenuineness before, so that's pretty exciting for me. So I'm going to continue to read this beautiful sketch by Nathaniel Parker Willis. Why am I saying this over and over? So we can remember that these are somebody else's words and not Elizabeth Keckley's. With all the splendor that was around this little fellow in his new home, he was so bravely and beautifully himself, and that only. Oh, wow, that is a fantastic thing, to be bravely and beautifully yourself. How many of us can say that we are bravely and beautifully ourselves? And it strikes me that he was around 10 years old because of something my mom used to say. So my mom would always ask people, and I do the same thing now actually, what did you want to be when you were 10? What did you want to do when you were 10? What things were fun for you when you were 10? And she always would take people back to 10 years old because she said that's when people are really truly themselves, when they're around that 10-year mark. Younger kids are, lots of people are people pleasers, but younger kids are often trying to please parents or friends or whatever, as are older kids. But when you're around that 10-year mark, a lot of people just are doing their own thing, whatever that thing is. And so my mom would always ask people, well, what did you want to be when you were 10? And I find myself a lot asking people, like, what were you interested in? What was fun for you? and they'll tell me and they light up. And then I always ask, what happened that made you stop? What changed? What can you do to get back some of that joie de vivre you had when you were 10? So this is really interesting to me that this Nathaniel Parker Willis is saying that around 10 years of age, Willie Lincoln was bravely and beautifully himself. And I charge all of us to be bravely and beautifully yourself. I'll continue reading. A wild flower transplanted from the prairie to the hothouse. He retained his so he is likening Willie Lincoln to a wildflower. A wild flower transplanted from the prairie to the hothouse. He retained his prairie habits unalterably pure and simple till he died. His leading trait seemed to be a fearless and kindly frankness, willing that everything should be as different as it pleased, but resting unmoved in his own conscious single heartedness. I found I was studying him irresistibly as one of the sweet problems of childhood that the world is blessed with in rare places. And the news of his death, I was absent from Washington on a visit to my own children at the time, came to me like a knell heard unexpectedly at a merrymaking. A knell is the sound of a bell, and when people are saying knell, they're usually kind of alluding to something that the bell is ringing for like a bad reason. Back to his words. On the day of the funeral, I went before the hour to take a near farewell look at the dear boy, for they had embalmed him to send him home to the West, to sleep under the sod of his own valley, and the coffin lid was to be closed before the service. The family had just taken their leave of him, and the servants and nurses. I wonder if Elizabeth Keckley was there with the servants and nurses, just saying. And the servants and nurses were seeing him for the last time, and with tears and sobs wholly unrestrained, for he was loved like an idol by every one of them. I find that concerning, but I'll just keep reading. He lay with eyes closed, his brown hair parted as we had known it, pale in the slumber of death, but otherwise unchanged, for he was dressed as if for the evening, and held in one of his hands, crossed upon his breast, a bunch of exquisite flowers, a message coming from his mother while we were looking upon him that those flowers might be preserved for her. Oh, she's sending her baby to the ground with flowers, that those flowers might be waiting for her. Mm. She was lying sick in her bed, worn out with grief and overwatching. The funeral was very touching. Of the entertainments in the East Room the boy had been, for those who now assembled more especially, a most life-giving variation. With his bright face and his apt greetings and replies, he was remembered in every part of the crimson curtained hall, built only for pleasure. So the East Room was apparently a room with red curtains, and it was where entertaining happened, and that seemed a fitting place to hold Willie's funeral because he, like the room, was life giving and bright. Okay. With his bright face and his apt greetings and replies, he was remembered in every part of that crimson curtained hall, built only for pleasure. Of all the crowds each night, certainly the one least likely to be death's first mark. He was his father's favorite. They were intimates, often seen hand in hand. And there sat the man, with a burden on his brain at which the world marvels, bent now with the load at both heart and brain, staggering under a blow like the taking from him of his child. His men of power sat around him, McClellan with a moist eye when he bowed to the prayer, as I could see from where I stood, and Chase and Seward with their austere features at work, and senators and ambassadors and soldiers all struggling with their tears, great heart sorrowing with the president as a stricken man and brother. That God may give him strength for all his burdens is, I am sure, at present a prayer of the nation. To have people mingle their tears with yours in a time of mourning is powerful and comforting. And this is what was happening for President Lincoln, but very telling is that it did not seem to be happening for Mrs. Lincoln. Now, Mrs. Lincoln didn't go to the funeral Um, but this is very President Lincoln centered, right? Like, I would have expected to have heard more from a woman's point of view. What was happening with Mrs. Lincoln? Where was she? Who was with her? Who's consoling her? And from the point of a seamstress, I would have really expected to have heard more about what was happening with Mrs. Lincoln. But I have to remind myself of the time period and the push for Black people writing at this time to really show their authority and that their belonging. And what better way to show that than to center what you're saying on the president instead of on his life? Anyway, we've got like two sentences left in this chapter. So the bulk of what we have read today was the sketch by what's his name? I've said it 1,000 times, Nathaniel Parker Willis, but these last two sentences are Keckley's words. This sketch was very much admired by Mrs. Lincoln. Ah, okay. That's where we're getting her perspective. Very good. I copy it from the scrapbook in which she pasted it with many tears and with her own hand. And so that ends chapter 6 of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda.